My guest is Mr. Samson Itodo. He's Executive Director of Yaga Africa. He joins us from our Abuja studio. Mr. Itodo, thank you for coming on the program.
Thanks, Geoffrey. Always a delight to be here.
I'm happy you're not just an election and governance man, you're also a lawyer. So let me allow you to do some heavy lifting. So I was just concerned when I saw that the DSS had sued Professor Utomi. So a background to that is the effect that Professor Utomi has said he's going to set up a shadow government to look at how government is delivering on its mandate, more like the agents of government, policy for policy and preference solution. Well, the APC responded through their spokesperson, Mr. Felix Moka, and a three-pager calling him an intellectual there's a name, it's called, I can't remember the full name now, in that sense. So, well, I did interview Professor Pat last week, Friday, and said, Prof, what exactly do you mean? How is it going to work? We're running presidential, not parliamentary system. And I explained that, look, some set of individuals having expertise in different areas will be checking government policy for policy, looking at options and criticizing, and, you know, just like the parliament will do. Well, I had Mr. Felix Moka in the studio, and I told him, now that you've understood the explainer of Mr. Professor Utomi, would you apologize? He said, no, the way Prof went about it, but now you understand. So to now see the DSS pick up this, what do you make of it?
Well, I think that the response of the state to Professor Utomi's proposed action it really raises a couple of concerns, and it's concerns with respect to what is the place of dissent in a democracy. What is a place of accountability in a democracy? Because all the erudite professor just said is establishing or setting up a shadow government to hold the government to account. It doesn't in any way mean that he's usurping the powers of the president or he's establishing a parallel government. For those who know how shadow governments actually work, it's just an instrument of accountability. It's just a symbolic, accountability action. And citizens have a right, to ask questions and hold government to account depending on the vehicle that they use. But I see no reason why they're instituting, a litigation, an action against Professor Utomi. I would strongly advise against it. I think he has explained what he meant, by that. It's not in any way seeking to unconstitutionally remove or usurp the powers of the president. President Tinubu still remains the president of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. He's a creation of the Constitution, and so he have the legislature that exists to limit the exercise of executive powers. But initiatives as the ones proposed by Professor Utomi is just nothing but holding government to account. Critiquing government and government policies is how democracy thrives. So I think that we should encourage efforts where citizens are able, to interrogate government policies and profile alternatives and solutions. That's how our nation actually grows. The country cannot grow with one set of individuals determining the structure, the form, the content of how government should run. No, that's not how democracy works. Democracy works on diversity and competition of ideas.
We're going to come to some of the electoral reforms that we're supposed to talk about, but talk to us about how this is playing out in terms of optics, because it's very worrying. The PDP, for instance, is not put together with the greatest sense of respect to them. In fact, there are three national secretaries in that sense, 2 and 3. Labour Party, I read it today, Labour Party in Lagos is having 3 people they want to correspond with INEC, and they have 2 at the national level. And then you have individuals within these parties that are trying to be some voices of opposition. They're either man-marked by individuals within the ruling party, either online or offline, in that sense. Word for word, and sometimes it gets dirty. So now this looks like the only form that looks a bit organized, and this is coming with a litigation. Isn't this even giving credence to what Prof is even talking about, that this is hostility to dissenting voice?
No, quite frankly, I don't think it's good optics for the government. The most important thing is Professor Utomi has explained what he meant by, a shadow government. And once he's done that, he's exonerated himself, from any allegation of an attempt to usurp the powers of the president or remove the president unconstitutionally. He has explained it, and this every Nigerian, will understand the plain language which Professor Utomi actually spoke. So I really think that this is not good optics. It actually suggests that there's a rejection and a strong opposition, to dissent and calls for accountability. And I hope that, the DSS can reconsider its decision. If it needed any form of clarification, it would have written, to Pat Utomi to explain what he meant. But the erudite prof has explained, like you referenced in your interview, what he meant by a shadow government. It doesn't mean he's establishing, another government within an existing constitutional order, because the constitutional order that we recognize today is President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. That is established and it's not in doubt in any way. A shadow government is simply is a form of social engagement and social control, but also social accountability. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, in my considered opinion.
All right, Mr. Itodo, let's go to electoral matters now, because for me, if it was just politicians giving themselves what Nigerians call basbos in that direction, I would have been okay. It's normal things they do, but having an institution of state getting into these murky waters is very disturbing, and I wish that the DSS can explain themselves even further, because it's very concerning. But let's talk about, the INEC had said they have about 140 so reviews from what they've seen in the 2023 presidential election or general election, and ahead of 2027, they submitted some things that we don't know the content, but you've also done some background work. So let's take a look at some of the things we really need, because recruitment process is still a challenge for Nigerians, and the layers are many. So walk us through some of the things we should be insisting on before 2027 in terms of reforms.
Well, thanks, Geoffrey. I think Nigerians need to know that today makes it exactly 646 days to the 2027 elections. And it's about 1 year and 8 months. And what that means is we do not have time. And there's a great need for the National Assembly to conclude on the ongoing reforms. And ahead of the 2027 elections, there are 6 types of elections that were expected. We expect that there will be by-elections. There's the Anambra election. There's the Ekiti, the Osun governorship election ahead of the 2027 elections. There's the FCT area council elections due in February next year. So we have all these elections, but you also see that the trust level in the electoral process is very low based on what Afrobarometer, Yiga Africa, including NY polls have told us. But INEC has proposed some amendments to the Electoral Act and also the Constitution. Now you think about what are those reforms that are needed that we need to prioritize. For me, there are about 5, what you might call landmark proposed amendments. The first amendment that is required to inspire trust and confidence in Nigerians is mandatory electronic transmission of results. The reason why you need mandatory transmission of election results is to deepen the integrity of the electoral process. Now, that's one. The second point relates to the PVCs, whether we need the PVCs to vote. As of today, Geoffrey, you and I know that the BVAS has the voters register, and once a voter shows up at the polling units, if they tender any form of identification, as long as your name is on the voters register, you should be allowed to cast your vote. And this saying that no PVC, no vote, I think is obsolete. We need to move beyond that in view of the role of the BVAS. Because we've seen Nigerians who've been disenfranchised, not because they refused to turn up to collect their permanent voter's card, but as a result of INEC's logistical challenges. So why do you discriminate and disenfranchise those people? And now INEC is proposing that electronically downloadable PVCs should be allowed, to cast for voters to tender in the course of voter verification. The third point is about the appointment process. One thing is really interesting. This is actually the first INEC that seemed to be pushing for the removal of the powers of the president to appoint commissioners. Although INEC is proposing that the power be removed from the president and vested in INEC with respect to the appointment of resident electoral commissioners. But like Justice Uwais recommended, that power to appoint both the INEC chairman and the national commissioners and the resident electoral commissioners should be removed from the president and vested, in another institution that enjoys multi-stakeholder participation. The other amendment relates to early voting. Geoffrey, I don't know when last you voted in an election, but here is a country, in our country today, journalists are unable to cast their vote, security officials are unable to cast their vote, INEC officials, accredited observers are unable to cast their vote because they are involved in election services. That is not proper in a country that seeks to defend the rights of voters. Therefore, early voting is one form, one strategy of protecting the rights of this category of people to cast their vote. And that is on the table in this current reform process, and it should be encouraged.
Let's talk about something I saw that played out at the National Assembly, where I think there's a bill to that effect as to making it mandatory for persons to vote. Shouldn't voting be voluntary? We know it's our civic duty, but this bill intends to make it compulsory because we have a declining number in terms of voter turnout, given the number of people that are registered to collect their PVC, voter apathy in that sense. Should we make voting mandatory? Would that be legal?
I think it's important to know that Nigeria will not be the first country that practices compulsory voting. Australia practices compulsory voting. But here is my take, Geoffrey. I understand the rationale behind that proposed bill, which is to encourage, turnout at elections, because Nigeria has the lowest turnout in elections in the whole of Africa, even though we have the highest number of registered voters in our voters register, but we have the lowest turnout. 25% in the last election is abysmally poor. I understand the rationale, but I think compelling and also imposing 6 months jail term is draconian in every respect, and it undermines the freedom to participate in the electoral process. I think that bill totally amounts to legislative overkill. I don't think that it will pass. We cannot compel participation, because not participating is also another form of political participation, and we need to recognize that. And if the National Assembly, in its wisdom, is seeking ways, to enforce and ensure turnout in an election, then we need to ensure that votes count. Because if people trust that their votes will count at elections, they will show up. Secondly, people who are elected in elections should deliver good governance, so that when people reconcile the state of their livelihood and their participation in elections, they will turn up to cast their vote subsequently. But when people stand in long queues, they vote for people into office, and when people get into office, they don't solve problems that their voters ask them to solve. They only are interested in primitive accumulation of wealth. When that happens, people feel that voting is a waste of their time because leaders don't solve the problems that they vote them into power to solve. Or when they are given power in trust for the people, they abuse that power and use that same power to oppress the people. When that happens, people will have no reason why they should show up to cast their vote. So I think these are issues that we should address using the reform process rather than compelling voters to cast their vote. I understand the rationale. It's a good rationale. It's good intention, but this approach is not what will increase turnout at elections.
It was, when I saw it, it was very concerning as well to say somebody will have to go to jail for not voting. It's just funny. But the lawmakers will have to do what the lawmakers will have to do. Ours is just to put them on the spot to know exactly whether this is well thought through. There's another part of election that I would like to speak to as we close, and that has to do with local government elections. I have noticed that when it comes to local government elections, the maximum we see is perhaps INEC register. I do not think, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe not across the country, that they use beavers for local government elections, do they?
Well, thank you, Geoffrey, for actually bringing that issue. Because there's actually a topical issue that's happening in Lagos, and maybe I should just speak to that. If you look at what's happening in Lagos, the State Electoral Commission, has issued, notice and has fixed, a date in July for elections. Now, the law is very clear. Provisions of the Electoral Act are very clear, Chapter 5 to be specific, that local government elections, shall hold not earlier than 150 days and not later than 30 days, to the expiration of the term of the current office holders. The date fixed by the Lagos State Electoral Commission is 13 days outside the official time frame provided in the provisions of the Electoral Act. Therefore, if the State Electoral Commission proceeds with the current date, it will be running foul of the Electoral Act, and the same fate that befell the Rivers State local government election might befall Lagos State. So I think it's important that stakeholders are quite aware. But you think about, local government elections, quite frankly, yes, they don't use beavers for obvious reasons, because the beavers is used for national elections. And these are opportunities that are provided in this reform process to see how can we sanitize that entire process of voter accreditation to make local governments more transparent and credible.
Mr. Itodo, there's a lot when it comes to this reform. So we'll be looking at National Assembly and persons like you to bring us up to speed as to how to better strengthen our electoral system. Samson Itodo is the Executive Director of Yaga Africa, joining us from Abuja studios. Thank you, sir, for coming on the program.
Thanks for having me.